What are Hasidic Jews?
Some of the biblical prophets emphasized the notion of God's unconditional, absolutely faithful love, chesed in Hebrew. They taught that God would continue to seek out sinners and bring them back. Out of that emphasis grew an important theme in Jewish spirituality. A focus on the transforming power of divine compassion. Learning and moral righteousness were still worthy goals, of course, but not to such a degree that they should raise divisions in a community that amounted to religious class distinctions. Most important was the quest for individual salvation sought within community. A major movement organized around these emphases was begun in Eastern Europe by Israel ben Eliezer, c. 1700 to 1760, known as the Baal Shem Tov, Master of the Good Name, that is that of God. He was a highly charismatic man with a reputation for working wonders, especially healing. He de-emphasized Talmudic scholarship in favor of devotional intensity. After his death, the Hasidic movement became more formally organized as a closed society. Around the person of a charismatic leader called the Tzaddik, literally, righteous one. As the community grew, subgroups developed and carried the spirit of the tradition abroad. Most notably to Israel and New York. The Chabad branch moved more toward scholarship and education while other groups stayed focused on emotional involvement in devotion. Hasidic groups have often been excommunicated even though none have formally broken away.
What is the Kabbia and why is it important?
According to tradition, Abraham and his son Ishmael built, or perhaps rebuilt, a simple cube-like structure in what came to be the center of the city of Mecca. During Muhammad's time, the Kaaba was a relatively small structure, about 15 feet tall. With a black stone, the size of a bowling ball, of, perhaps, meteoric origin built into one of its corners. Rebuilt several times since Muhammad's day, the Kaaba now stands about 43 feet high, with irregular sides ranging from 36 to 43 feet. During Muhammad's lifetime, the building is said to have housed some 360 idols. In 630, Muhammad cleansed the Kaaba, and it has since remained empty except for some lamps. Its holiness as a symbol of divine presence derives largely from its associations with the lives of Abraham and Muhammad.
How many different kinds of scriptural writings are there?
Sacred literature has taken virtually every form imaginable. The most ancient texts in many traditions are poetic, hymns of praise, songs of thanksgiving for victory, or prayers of petition for a favorable harvest. Early poetic texts are typically associated with liturgical rituals. Related to these are modified types of poetry adapted to specialized purposes such as prophecies or soothsaying or incantations meant to give power to the one who utters them. Wisdom sayings in the form of easy-to-remember proverbs are part of nearly every tradition. Narrative accounts in prose play several essential roles. One is to recount the deeds of the spiritual powers that brought the community into being. The gods, these are typically called myth. Another is to preserve the history of the community or the biography of a foundational figure. Narratives also illustrate the central tenets of the tradition by way of vivid example. As in just as our ancestor in faith did when. Prophetic texts can be either poetry or prose. But either way, their main purpose is not generally to foretell the future, as is commonly assumed. Prophets speak on behalf of an ultimate spiritual power and their focus is typically on the need for change here and now. Another important type of religious text is called apocalyptic, from a Greek term meaning revelatory. Apocalyptic literature often uses highly figurative language, describing in detail events that the author has seen in visions or dreams and that will soon come to pass. Such dramatic texts are often taken as direct predictions of how the end of time will come about. Finally, many scriptures include rules or laws in the form of commands and prohibitions. But only a few sacred texts are entirely legal.
Was Hinduism ever identified with any political regimes?
Several important royal dynasties that identified themselves with Hindu tradition ruled various parts of India and Southeast Asia over a span of about 2,000 years. In some cases the dynasties bolstered their claims to political legitimacy by appealing to the concept of divine kingship. A series of fairly short-lived early Hindu dynasties, the Nanda, 362 to 322 BCE, Maurya, 322 to 185 BCE, and Shunga, 185 to 73 BCE, evidently faltered as a result of their failure to keep priestly members of the royal court happy with the balance of power. The Gupta dynasty, 320 to 647 CE, was the first major success story, taking control over the northern two-thirds of India. Promoting devotion to Vishnu especially, the Guptas oversaw what some call a renaissance of Hindu culture. After the fall of the Guptas, several Hindu dynasties ruled various segments of central and southern India. Among the most important were the Tamil kingdoms of the south, especially the Pallavas, c. 250 to 750 CE, Chalukyas, 450-1189, and the Cholas, minor power from 100 CE. Expanded 800-1300 CE, all of which were major patrons of religious art and architecture. Hindu kingdoms outside of India. Hindu kingdoms, mostly Shaivite in orientation, had significant influence on parts of Southeast Asia, giving rise to the names Indochina and Indonesia. The Kingdom of Kampa held sway over most of Vietnam from 150-1471 CE, while several other dynasties arose. In Cambodia in the 2nd century and expanded their control over Laos and Thailand from 800 to 1200 CE. During that same period, Hindu monarchies took root in Java and Sumatra, the principal islands of Indonesia, as well as in Malaysia. For nearly 2 centuries, Hinduism was a major influence throughout Indonesia, until its political patrons succumbed to Muslim invasions in the early 16th century. The remnants of the Southeast Asian Hindu kingdoms took refuge on the island of Bali, where many still practice Hinduism.
Do Shinto practitioners pray in any particular language?
Since Shinto has been an exclusively Japanese phenomenon, it will come as no surprise that Shinto prayers have almost always been expressed in Japanese. That does not necessarily mean that Japanese functions as a liturgical or canonical language, as Sanskrit does in Hindu tradition or as Latin once did in Roman Catholic tradition. The role of Japanese in Shinto practice is a purely functional one. It's the vernacular language of virtually everyone associated with Shinto. There is, however, one important respect in which Japanese usage in Shinto ritual does retain the flavor of a sacred tongue. Many Shinto prayers that priests recite in shrines are quite ancient. The language and vocabulary are so archaic that only the most learned and specially trained Japanese fully understand what is being said. In that sense, the continued use of the classical language has the feel of, say, the Catholic Church's use of Latin well into the 20th century.
What is meant by the term anti-Semitism?
Jews generally think of themselves as descended from Semitic racial or ethnic stock. Tradition says that the principal branches of the tree of humanity grew from Noah's male offspring, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Descendants of Shem are called Semites. The earliest Semites spread all over what we call the Central Middle East, from northern Syria and Iraq to the south of the Arabian Peninsula, and from the Mediterranean eastward to what was once called Mesopotamia. Jews are ethnically one of several families of Semites. Beginning in Roman times, Jews all over the Mediterranean became the objects of hatred and intolerance because of their refusal to revere the emperor. Through the history of the Middle Ages, especially in Europe, animosity toward Jews runs like a dark cultural and religious thread. Particularly in areas predominantly Christian, Jews suffered massive discrimination and segregation largely because Jews generally preferred not to surrender their identity through assimilation, and because so many Jews were sufficiently successful in their endeavors to arouse envy. Gradually there arose a popular notion that enmity for Jews had a rational basis in the racial inferiority of Semitic people. Only those of Aryan descent could claim racial purity. The earliest formal anti-Semitic organizations appeared in Austria in the late 19th century. After the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, some Europeans sought to fuel the flames of hatred. Still further by claiming that Jews were in league with the Bolsheviks in promoting godless communism. This was among the first of many global conspiracy theories that attributed virtually everything evil to Jews. It was a relatively short step from there to Adolf Hitler's attempts to rid the earth of racial pollution once and for all. Today the two most important Semitic groups are Arabs and Jews. Strictly speaking, the term anti-Semitism ought to include Arabs. But by common usage it has come to refer only to anti-Jewish sentiment.
Do Hindus mark their sacred spaces with any distinctive signs and symbols?
Hindu temples are often very easily identified, especially if the sacred place has been built as such from the start. Rather than occupying a structure originally designed for some other purpose. Two major architectural styles developed in India. The southern style features three-tiered pyramidal spires, called shikhara. Atop each of the temple's interior shrines or womb chambers, garbhagriha. A monumental trapezoidal facade called a royal gateway. Rajagopuram, typically rises 30 to 50 feet above the main roofline. Both the spires and the facade are nowadays generally finished in white, with small gold finials on top. Southern temples often house several shrines under a single flat roof, with the individual spires of the shrines protruding through the roof and visible to all who approach. The classic northern style historically had a large outer unroofed enclosure, within which stood a series of separate ritual spaces arranged additively along a single east-west axis. As in the southern style, the center of northern temples is always the shrine or womb chamber. Typically a small dark room with only one door and a tall multi-tiered spire above. Attached to the shrine by a narrow passageway toward the east one might find a larger room for devotees to gather, and sometimes another, still larger, east of that dedicated to other ritual needs, such as ritual dancing. In other words, the various ritual functions the southern style puts together under one roof. The northern style arranges in more or less distinct spaces that look like small separate structures. Most of the Hindu temples built recently in the United States are in the southern style. The overall design is more convenient in multi-seasonal climates and allows for a variety of shrines, so that one temple can serve the needs of members of various denominations.
Do deists and practitioners of CCT celebrate the birthdays of any religious figures?
Deities both great and small are generally thought to have birthdays because the vast majority of them were once human beings. CCT has transformed numerous figures originally deist, Buddhist, and Confucian into more comfortable characters, members of everybody's family, in effect. Other deities remain in their more exalted original deist forms. The following are only a few of the literally hundreds of divine birthday dates. Among the earliest in the year is the Jade Emperor, celebrated on the 9th of the first month. On the third day of the second month, CCT acknowledges Wen Changdijun, the god of literature and learning. Guanyin's birthday occurs on the 19th of the second month. Xiantian Shangdi, the supreme emperor of dark heaven, was born on the 3rd of the third month and is celebrated in some 400 Taiwanese temples. A quasi-deist deity called the Great Emperor who protects life, Bao Sheng Da Di, is celebrated on the 15th of the third month. Ma Ziu, often referred to as the Great Aunt or Grandma, has her celebration on the 23rd of the third month. On the 13th day of month 5 the general become deity Guandi gets his due. An otherwise anonymous city god's day is the 15th of the sixth month. Devotees of CCT observe the birthdays of Cao Jun on the third day of the 8th month, and that of Tu Digong on the 15th. Also on the 3rd of that month deists celebrate the birthday of Si Ming, the director of destiny, known in CCT as the kitchen god or hearth deity.
How do trials or ordeals function in Shinto ritual?
Remnants of ancient practices reminiscent of trial by fire survive in several Shinto ceremonies, most of which are still practiced, in relatively few locations. Unique to the Suwa Shrine in Nagasaki is a frightening ritual called Yotaitsai. At the end of the purification and exorcism rituals, the chief priest of the shrine thrusts his hand into a kettle of boiling water. This rite dates back to the Shug-Endo sect of late medieval times. Now it represents not the ascetic or magical power of ancient practitioners, or the power to banish spirits possessing an unfortunate soul, but the need for radical purification. Some sects use a variation on this ritual, with a priest scattering scalding water on the main participant with a bamboo stick. A related ritual of trial involves walking over burning coals, called Shinkashiki, taming the fire. The ceremony involves circumambulating the bed of embers before walking across it. Anyone present may participate after the principal ritualists complete the ordeal. Again, the purpose is purification, and prayers may include petitioning the kami of the moon to exert his influence on the fire kami.
What does the term Matsuri mean?
Matsuri is the inclusive word for virtually all Shinto-inspired communal celebrations. The term derives from a root that can mean to deify or enshrine. These festivities generally celebrate manifestations of the kami who have a special relationship to a region or town. Though some celebrate kami of more widespread significance as well. They acknowledge the inseparable link among the kami, the land, and the community of people living there. Since it emphasizes the seamless interrelationships among these three elements. Shinto tradition makes no distinction between sacred and profane time. All of creation, time, and space, is sacred. Matsuri mark those times and places that are more than ordinarily sacred. Just when divine energy appears on the wane, a Matsuri occurs and renews that spiritual potency. Festivities periodically restore the ancient cosmic order of nature. Japanese often celebrate Matsuri with an enormous vigor, and almost uncontrolled energy. Bands of young men undertake strenuous feats of lifting and hauling enormous loads, competing with other groups to deliver their sacred burdens to the shrine or another ritual destination. That feeling of wild unpredictability offers an important insight into the Shinto sense of the divine as both benevolent and dangerous. Some Matsuri are explicitly identified as non-religious civic events. But even today the majority are of religious origin and reflect classical Shinto or folk beliefs, or both. Most also retain their ancient associations with seasonal and agricultural concerns. Matsuri typically include both processions and activities within a shrine compound. Special offerings and prayers, plays and dancing and other entertainments. And communal meals are features of all the great festivities.
What is an icon?
Icon comes from the Greek word icon, meaning image or likeness. From around the 400s on, the use of colorful two-dimensional images of Christ, Mary and the saints became an essential part of Byzantine liturgical and devotional prayer. Most icons depict the sacred figure frontally, often displaying a very stylized face that directs a striking gaze at the viewer. Some have described the devotional act of venerating an icon as a process of seeing and being seen, almost as if the image had a life of its own. Artists who create icons are called iconographers, people who write with pictures. They undergo a long and very traditional course of training, steeped in spiritual practices of prayer and asceticism. They employ only natural materials in their art and follow strict canons concerning characteristic ways of depicting certain figures and specific prescriptions about size and proportions of the sacred figure's form. Many icons use gold leaf for the sky around the holy figure, an immediate clue that the world into which the artist invites the viewer is not that of everyday life, but a spiritual realm beyond this. In Orthodox and other Eastern Catholic churches, a screen called the iconostasis, place of the icons, stands between worshippers and the sacred action occurring on the altar beyond. in addition to individual icons placed on stands in various parts of the church. Further mural-like images are displayed across the iconostasis.
Do Christians engage in exorcism?
Many readers will be at least vaguely familiar with a novel called The Exorcist, or with the movie based on it. The author based his story loosely on a now legendary series of events said to have taken place in St. Louis, Missouri some 50 years ago. Exorcism has long been available to Roman Catholics as a ritual designed to free individuals thought to be possessed and tormented by evil spirits. Church authorities have very rarely given permission to perform exorcisms, and only after extensive psychiatric and medical consultation. The local bishop appoints a priest known for his sanctity, sanity, and personal strength to act as the principal ritual specialist. That exorcist then prepares to use a set ritual and to subject himself to whatever spiritual discipline may be necessary to withstand the rigors of the experience. Peculiar and frightening occurrences are said to accompany exorcisms. Father William Bowdern, the Jesuit priest who performed the St. Louis exorcism, refused ever to speak of the experience in public, except to affirm that he did indeed believe in the existence of the devil. According to the New Testament, Jesus and his apostles performed a number of exorcisms, a practice not altogether rare among Jews and pagans of the time. His actions are the ultimate sanction for the practice in Roman Catholicism. During medieval and even into early modern times, some people were executed as witches because they proved impervious to exorcism. Until about 30 years ago, Roman Catholic practice continued to confer on candidates to the priesthood the minor order or office of exorcist. Exorcism remains relatively common among some Christian denominations, especially Pentecostal or charismatic groups. Leaders of worship might perform an exorcism as one among many manifestations of the Spirit, by prayer and touch intended to free the one possessed. Here exorcism is generally a very brief part of the larger ritual. A much simplified form of exorcism remains a brief preliminary part of the ritual of baptism in many churches.
Is it appropriate to call Shinto a religious tradition?
Religious studies scholars have increasingly come to appreciate the genuinely religious qualities of Shinto. Every now and then criticism still surfaces that Shinto is so much a part of ordinary Japanese life that it is really a set of cultural beliefs and practices rather than a religious tradition. Some critics base their conclusion on polls of the Japanese public that seem to suggest widespread apathy about religious issues. Decreasing numbers of people are willing to identify themselves as adherents of any religious tradition, including Shinto. Other critics note that even Japanese who do consider themselves active participants in a Shinto-based community are likely to claim that they are Buddhist as well.
Is pilgrimage an important part of Christian tradition?
By about the 4th century, pilgrimage to Jerusalem had become common enough that significant examples of a type of literature called the pilgrimage narrative have survived. Pilgrims talk of their burning desire to visit sites mentioned in the Old Testament, as well as those associated with key events in the life of Christ. Emperor Constantine's renovation of many of the holy places also made the practice more popular. After the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem and surrounding lands in 638 CE, Christian access diminished somewhat, then improved for a while under the Crusaders' Latin kingdom. But during the Middle Ages, other sacred sites associated with famous saints gradually replaced Jerusalem as the goal of choice for countless European pilgrims. The Shrine of Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain was a major site, said to be built around the remains of Saint James the Apostle. Compostela came to symbolize Christian efforts against the infidel Muslims in the Holy Land. In more recent times, the practice of pilgrimage to Jerusalem and associated holy places has revived with increased ease of travel. Some Christians also flock to lesser shrines associated with saints or apparitions of the Virgin Mary. Pilgrimage was once occasionally prescribed for individuals as penance for sins, but it has never been a central requirement for Christians as it has for Muslims.
What is a miracle?
A miracle is broadly defined as an apparent breach in the laws of nature that so defies rational explanation as to suggest the possibility of divine intervention. Miracles or the working of wonders figure prominently in the sacred texts and lore of most major religious traditions, but they do not necessarily serve the same purpose from one tradition to another. In some cases, miracles are believed to provide incontrovertible proof of the truth of a particular revelation by establishing beyond doubt the power of the agent. Miracles are not just a fancy extra tossed in to entertain the masses, but an integral part of some systems of belief. Sometimes miracles occur in the context of a controversy by way of a dramatic settlement in favor of the miracle worker. One characteristic of miracles that does appear to be a feature in many traditions is that those who choose obstinately not to believe do not necessarily change their minds in the presence of a miracle. In fact, they simply do not see what the believers standing next to them see. That seems to suggest that, in some traditions at least, wonders are in the eye of the beholder, so that a witness must be predisposed to see a miracle. Some traditions regard miracles as a gift from a divine source to certain special persons, whether prophets or saints, designed to establish their spiritual credentials. A miracle can revolve around some symbolic action that, even apart from the apparently miraculous result, contains the central message.
Is there such a thing as converting into Shinto?
Since Shinto is so intimately identified with being Japanese, the concept of conversion is largely irrelevant. That does not mean that no non-Japanese has ever deliberately chosen to become a practitioner of Shinto. But such instances are very rare. The case of Judaism offers a rough parallel. Many consider membership in Judaism a matter of ethnicity. But some Jewish congregations nevertheless welcome converts into their community. Some have developed formal initiatory rites for ethnically non-Jewish individuals. But Shinto tradition does not have such a rite for non-Japanese who wish to practice and profess Shinto tradition. The difference here is that membership in Judaism presupposes assent to certain basic creedal affirmations, whereas Shinto does not.
What kinds of rituals do Jews engage in privately or alone?
Home remains the principal place for Jewish prayer and religious observance. Traditional prayer includes the thrice daily Amidah, standing, prayer in morning, afternoon, and evening. The morning and evening prayers begin with benedictions that praise God's love of Israel as manifested in the creation of light and in the ordering of day and night. The Shema follows, acknowledging the one God's redemption of the people. At the center of all three prayers is the Shemona Esrei, or 18 blessings. Prayer ends with the Elenu, upon us praise is incumbent. Afternoon prayer usually adds Psalm 145. According to the Talmud, all Jews should pray 100 benedictions. Birachot, every day, in recognition of all things enjoyable, to give thanks. And prior to all other religious duties, in addition to the blessings that are part of daily prayers.
Have there been any important Confucian reformers?
Wang Yangming, 1472–1529 CE, was an outspoken government official of the Ming dynasty. He was perhaps the most influential teacher of the Neo-Confucian school of mind. Also known as the idealists, Xin Shui. Wang believed that the teaching of his predecessors in the Neo-Confucian movement had lost all credibility when Yuan dynasty bureaucrats made it the official curriculum for civil service examinations. Reduced to a fixed set of questions and answers. Neo-Confucian ideas no longer required people to think independently. Wang's major work, Investigation into the Great Learning, commented on the ancient Confucian text, underscoring the need for active engagement with ideas. He condemned slavish adherence to rigid canons of ritual propriety. Wang argued for an understanding of Li as a living universal principle rather than a list of prescribed procedures and policies. He borrowed from Daoist and Buddhist teachings, as earlier Neo-Confucians had done, attempting to reinvigorate the tradition as a way of interpreting the whole of life. And Wang reintroduced a metaphysical element by speaking of a true self and a heavenly principle. Above all, he insisted, one must not lose sight of the underlying challenge of human development and the struggle for moral improvement. Institutionalize what is meant to be a living tradition, Wang warned, and you create a giant fossil.
What is the season of Advent? Why is Christmas so important for Christians?
The Western Christian liturgical year begins with the first Sunday of Advent. Western churches set that Sunday as the one closest to the feast of St. Andrew, November 30th, while Eastern Christians begin a period of fast in preparation for Christmas on the feast of St. Philip, November 14th. For most Christians, 4 Sundays mark the season of waiting, an expectation of the birth of Christ. Christmas, the celebration of Jesus' birth, was originally fixed on December 25 around the year 336. That was the date then calculated as the winter solstice on the Roman calendar, with its symbolic celebration of the rebirth of the sun after the year's darkest day. In the practice of the liturgical churches, purple vestments still recall the originally penitential spirit of the season, with its overtones of apocalyptic expectation of Christ's second coming. But on the third Sunday, called Gaudete, Rejoice, Sunday, rose vestments introduce a note of relief. Christmas represents for all Christians the pivotal event in human history called the Incarnation, in which God took on human flesh and assumed all aspects of the human condition except sinfulness.
What attitudes toward pilgrimage are important in Confucianism and CIT?
Confucian teaching generally did not promote the popular practice of pilgrimage, associated as it was with Daoism and Buddhism. A larger concern had to do with the social and political implications of devotional travel. Many Confucians considered pilgrimage a potential threat to the stability of society. Anthropologists talk about the experience of liminality as an essential part of pilgrimage. Pilgrims step out of their accustomed social roles, leaving behind the rules, duties, and responsibilities of ordinary daily life. They become liminal in that they step across a threshold, limen in Latin, into another way of being and thinking, if only temporarily. For people who regard their function as maintaining social order, the prospect of throngs of pilgrims heading out across the countryside in hope of miracles or magic naturally poses a threat. Enthusiastic crowds are prey to demagogues and can turn into unruly mobs. Still, a parallel to devotional pilgrimage developed among Confucians on a smaller scale. Confucius himself became a model of the itinerant scholar. Traveling from one province to another in search of disciples and patrons. Later Confucians often followed his example. Eventually the places in which these Confucian exemplars had lived and taught began to attract visitors. Not surprisingly, the tomb of Confucius in Shandong became a goal for Confucian pilgrims, who were generally in search not of miracles, but of inspiration in the struggle to live a good life. In general, it appears that the tradition of family members caring for ancestral graves may have been significant in preventing burial places from becoming pilgrimage goals. Mountains were also important destinations for China's literati. There, one could contemplate most abundantly nature's sacred beauty. There, too, was the incomparable source of poetic inspiration.
How did Gautama become the Buddha?
At the age of 29, tradition says, Gautama made the great renunciation of comfort and security. Borne aloft by his horse, he went over the palace walls to pursue a realistic understanding of the world and the human condition. Gautama went first to learn from two Hindu teachers, spiritual guides like those who tutor seekers in the Hindu scriptures called the Upanishads. Unsatisfied with that more philosophical approach, Gautama joined a group of ascetics in Benares. Representatives of the Jain movement perhaps, and subjected himself to several years of dire austerity. When that, too, failed, he moved on and decided to meditate alone under a tree until he achieved enlightenment. During the course of 7 weeks there Siddhartha went through 4 trance-like stages, arriving finally at the stark realization of what Buddhist tradition calls the most basic truths of human life. Siddhartha was now worthy of the name Buddha, the enlightened one. But tradition suggests that the Buddha experienced a terrible interior struggle with the temptation to keep his newfound wisdom to himself. Mara, the demon, summoned up all his might to prevent the truths of enlightenment from spreading abroad. Overcoming all inclination to selfishness, the 35-year-old Buddha dedicated himself to teaching others the way to freedom from attachment that is the cause of all suffering. He returned to Benares, reunited with the 5 ascetics with whom he had parted company earlier, and preached the sermon called Turning the Wheel of the Law. Now the Buddha was indeed a wheel turner, but not as his father had envisioned. For the next 45 years, he would turn the greatest of all wheels, that of the Dharma. He died in Kushinagara at the age of 80, in about 463 BCE, of apparent food poisoning. Buddha on the big screen, some favorite motion pictures. Green Snake, 1993. A combination of mysticism and action based on a Chinese fable. Green Snake, Maggie Cheung, and Sun Qing, Joey Wang, are actual reptiles who have been practicing taking human form. When self-righteous Buddhist monk Fa Hai discovers them, He thinks it's a sin to tamper with the natural order. Cantonese with English subtitles. Kundan. 1997, in 1937, in a remote area of Tibet close to the Chinese border. A 2-year-old child is identified as the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, the compassionate Buddha. He is brought to Lhasa to be schooled as a monk and as head of state. The film follows him into adulthood until his flight to India after the Chinese invasion of Tibet. Little Buddha. 1993, Tibetan Lama Norbu informs the Conrad family of Seattle that their 10-year-old son Jesse may be the reincarnation of a respected monk. Stars Keanu Reeves? 7 years in Tibet. 1997, Heinrich Harrer, Brad Pitt, travels to the Himalayas on a mountain climbing trip. War breaks out and he is placed in a prisoner of war camp. He escapes to Tibet where he befriends the young Dalai Lama and witnesses the escalation of the conflict between Tibet and China. Temptation of a monk. 1994, costume drama about China's 7th century Tang dynasty. General Shi, Wu Xianguo, is duped into an assassination plot against the crown prince. After a massacre, the general flees and finds sanctuary with a group of Buddhist monks at a remote temple. Why has Bodhidharma left for the East? 1989. Set in a remote monastery in the Korean mountains, the film follows an old master, close to death, who must lead his disciples in their search for spiritual freedom. Korean with English subtitles.
How did Islam spread under Muhammad's immediate successors?
Muhammad's immediate successors, called caliphs, pronounced Ka'ilif, inherited an expanding but loose-knit social fabric. The Prophet had united the Bedouin tribes under the banner of Islam. But tribal loyalties cooled quickly when the leader died. When Muslim elders in Medina chose Muhammad's father-in-law Abu Bakr as the first caliph, the initial challenge was to regather the tribes already reverting to their pre-Islamic ways. Umar, 634-44, the second caliph, then mobilized tribal forces to move northward into Syria and Mesopotamia, Iraq, westward into Egypt, and eastward into Persia. Next, Umar instituted important policies in the conquered lands, allowing the subjected peoples to retain their religion and law, and levied taxes often lower than what had paid previously to Byzantium and Persia. Muslim armies remained apart in garrisons that eventually became cities in their own right. Umar's successors, Uthman, 644-656, and Ali, 656-661, compassed the downfall of the last Sasanian emperor, but had to deal with disastrous internal strife as well.
What special qualities do religious believers attribute to their scriptures?
Four important attributes of scriptures are literal and direct revelation, eternity, inerrancy, and inspiration. Some communities of faith regard their sacred texts as the literal, direct, unmediated divine word, though that word has been delivered through a particular human being. Tradition maintains that the messenger had no part in actually shaping the message. Naturally, every scripture is communicated in some recognizable human language, a tongue in which the divine speaker chooses to be heard. Scriptures also unfold in time, sometimes evolving over relatively extended periods of history. Even so, some traditions teach that this sacred word is eternal, existing always in the divine mind and entering into the physical world of sound, and eventually writing, only at the moment the revealer deems proper. Another common teaching is that divine communication must surely be perfect in every detail since it comes from a perfect source. Insistence on this quality of inerrancy raises all sorts of practical problems for interpreters, who sometimes find themselves scrambling to explain away blatant inconsistencies in factual data such as chronology or geography. Some communities of faith acknowledge that individual persons functioned from the very outset as human authors of sacred texts. Here the quality of inspiration explains that the divine speaker remains the actual author who entrusts the communication to a human writer.
What are the earliest Christian sacred writings?
Two broad types of literature comprise the bulk of the Christian scripture. Among the earliest documents are the letters of Paul. Tradition attributes 14 of the New Testament's 27 books or epistles to Paul, but it seems likely that several were penned under a pseudonym. The largest and most important of the texts are addressed to local Christian communities collectively. Romans, I and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, I and 2 Thessalonians. 4 are addressed to individual Christian leaders with whom Paul worked. I and 2 Timothy, Titus, Philemon. The addressees of the letter to the Hebrews, almost certainly not written by Paul, are curiously diffuse and not geographically identifiable as are the local churches. These epistles provide a great deal of information about the spread and organization of the early church, and, to a lesser degree, about the personality of this man of prodigious energy called Paul, a man some regard as the true founder of Christianity. 7 other letters, 2 attributed to Peter, 3 to John, 1 to James, and 1 to Jude, afford small glimpses into the variety of theological and practical issues facing the Christian diaspora. The communities developing beyond the central Middle East. At the heart of the Christian scriptures are 4 remarkable documents called Gospels, good news. Mark's Gospel, likely the earliest, is also the shortest of the 4. Matthew's is addressed largely to those of Jewish background. and Luke's followed within the next 20 to 30 years. Luke's also has the distinction of being part of the only consciously crafted two-volume work in the New Testament, completed by Luke's account of the post-Jesus Church in the Acts of the Apostles. Because of their similarity of perspective and emphases, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels. John's Gospel, often referred to as the most theological of the four, almost certainly came last, around the end of the 1st century CE. Last but not least is the Book of Revelation, also called the Apocalypse. Tradition attributes the work to John the Evangelist. Since the work seems to date from around the same time as the fourth Gospel.
What are some helpful clues for understanding Buddhist iconography?
Most important of all are images of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Buddhist sculpture and painting have evolved in many different styles. Each lineage or denomination has a number of symbols and signs to which it assigns special meanings. But it is possible to suggest some general features to look for when you visit a museum's Asian galleries. As with Hindu iconography, start by noting posture, gesture, garb, and other implements. Buddha images are usually seated in the lotus posture, legs crossed so that the soles of the feet face upward. Some images depict the Buddha standing or walking, but these are less numerous. Principal gestures include those that indicate blessing, teaching, or meditation. One of the most important has the left hand resting palm up in the lap and the right touching the ground just in front of the right knee, symbolizing the Buddha's conquest of Mara's temptation. Buddha images are typically clad in simple monk's garb and do not hold any specific tools or implements. Bodhisattvas sometimes appear seated in a relaxed posture called royal ease. But standing images are more common. They ordinarily wear crowns and royal finery as symbols of the life of the Buddha to be prior to his renunciation. Seated bodhisattvas often recline graciously forward and offer a gesture of kindly welcome or special attentiveness. Some bodhisattvas have multiple arms and heads to symbolize their infinite power and ability to respond to every human need. In their many hands these potent images can carry as many as several dozen separate items, including weapons, musical instruments, and symbols of healing. Guardian figures are the most numerous subordinate images, distant cousins of beings with similar functions in Hindu tradition. These characters glower menacingly on beings of evil intent and brandish weaponry sufficient to dispatch all undesirable elements daring to approach the holy place.
What is religion?
In its broadest sense, the term religion means adherence to a set of beliefs or teachings about the deepest and most elusive of life's mysteries. The word comes from an ancient Latin root, religo, that means to bind or to obligate. Religious persons join together in a shared quest to understand a host of perplexing questions.
What regular or annual observances have been part of Confucian tradition?
For many centuries Confucians celebrated with large feasts in the master's honor at both the vernal and autumnal equinoxes, corresponding with the 2nd and 8th lunar months. During the fourth of the night's 5 watches, celebrants paid homage to Confucius' ancestors and then moved to the central memorial hall at sunrise. Arrayed carefully across the entire main courtyard were row upon row of participants, arranged according to rank, with imperial bureaucrats along the sides and 6 groupings of students in the center. Before and within the memorial hall the offerings and sacrificial animals were arranged. These included a roll of silk, vessels full of wine, soup, and various foods, and a ritually slaughtered ox flanked by a pig and a lamb. A lengthy order of ceremony included specific offerings of each item, first to Confucius and then to the other sages enshrined in the main hall. This was accompanied by profound bowing and prostration, and songs of praise. A full classical Chinese orchestra punctuated by booming drum beats marked changes in the action. In addition to those semi-annual festivities, smaller semi-monthly observances included offerings to the spirit of Confucius at each new and full moon. In Korea, at the spring and autumn equinoxes, Confucians honor both Korean and Chinese sages at the Confucian University's shrine.
What does syncretism mean?
Syncretism is from a Greek root meaning mixed together and refers in general to the blending of doctrinal and ritual elements from 2 or more religious traditions to form a new tradition or sub-tradition. When 2 or more traditions coexist in a cultural context, they invariably rub elbows and influence each other to some extent. Though the main traditions typically retain their characteristic features, there are often pockets or areas in a region in which elements of the larger traditions coalesce to shape a recognizably new system of belief. The Druze communities of the Middle East, combining Islamic and Christian themes, and India's Sikh tradition, blending Hindu and Islamic elements, are examples. Syncretism can also describe to some extent the fact of change within major traditions themselves when over many centuries they develop in such a way that, say, a modern form of the tradition looks very different from much earlier stages. The histories of the greater Hindu and Buddhist traditions exemplify this type. Tibetan Buddhism, to be more specific, represents a remarkable blend of elements from indigenous Tibetan bone shamanism, tantric Hinduism, and Buddhism.
Is there a Shinto creed?
Shinto beliefs, like those of Daoism and the Chinese community traditions, have never been reduced to a concise formal summary statement. If one were to produce a brief Shinto creedal affirmation, it might go something like this. I believe that sacredness surrounds me, that it pervades all things including my very self, and that the all-suffusing divine presence is ultimately benevolent and meant to assure well-being and happiness for all who acknowledge it and strive to live in harmony with it. Shortly after the Meiji Restoration in 1868, the imperial authorities formulated the rough equivalent of a brief creedal statement, called the Three Great Teachings, in an attempt to enhance the emperor's status. The three teachings included patriotism and respect for the kami, the establishment of heavenly principles in relation to human culture, and dedication to the emperor and his pronouncements. Authorities interpreted the creed in the context of worship of the sun goddess Amaterasu, and the other chief deities in the creation myth. Although it approximated a creed in some ways, this statement was more like an acknowledgement of the importance of underlying religious conviction for the good order of Japanese society.
What were traditional criminal sanctions?
Within the sphere of penal law, death is warranted for apostasy and for highway robbery. Amputation of the hand for theft, death by stoning for sexual relations outside of marriage when the offender is married, and 100 lashes if the offender is unmarried, and 80 lashes for the drinking of an intoxicant or for an unproved accusation of unchastity. Civil offenses against the person, homicide, for example, or assault, are punishable by retaliation, with the offender subjected to the same treatment as the victim. In such civil cases, only the victim or his family has the right to prosecute, since the crime is not considered to be against the state. Often, the victim will choose monetary compensation, diya, blood money, in place of retaliation. Few predominantly Muslim societies today enact the traditional penalties as originally enjoined.
How did the Buddha reinterpret Hindu teaching?
Key notions Siddhartha learned as a young Hindu included those of karma, action; dharma, law; samsara, cycles of rebirth; and moksha, final liberation. Most Hindus of his day understood the concept of karma as external ritual action performed in the hope of tapping into divine power. Some religious thinkers were beginning to suggest that, along with ancient Vedic ritual under the direction of the priestly class, the acts of individual people might also influence their spiritual as well as material prospects. Others, like the Buddha, took their questioning of the old ways much further. They began to spiritualize the law of karma, explaining that choice and intent were more important than outward deeds. Along with their reinterpretation of karma, Some contemporaries of the Buddha were also rethinking the Hindu concept of dharma. No longer merely the impersonal, inscrutable law of cosmic order. Dharma now took on a personal ethical dimension. In the Buddha's view, karma included all the results of each individual's choices. He emphasized the need to purify one's intentions of all self-centeredness. Perform each act purely because it is your dharma, not because you hope to gain personally. The Hindu notion of samsara meant that the souls of individuals who died unliberated from the negative effects of their past actions would return in another form. The Buddha understood samsara to mean not only the cycle of physical rebirths, but the whole series of interior or spiritual stages the individual went through on the way to enlightenment. Finally, the Hindu idea of moksha meant the release of the indestructible soul, Atman, of each individual from the cycle of samsara. The Buddha also taught the possibility of a final liberation, but he gave it an important twist. Genuine liberation meant the complete cessation of all craving, even of craving for liberation itself. He called that final freedom nirvana, no wind, symbolizing the extinction of the flames of desire.
Does the sport of sumo wrestling have any Shinto connections?
Japan's ancient and still wildly popular sport of sumo wrestling is not itself a religious ritual, but it has surrounded itself with rituals associated with Shinto tradition. Once, these matches occurred on shrine grounds as part of the larger category of activities called divine entertainment. Today the bigger matches take place in specially decked out arenas and are scheduled in fortnightly tournaments at set times of the year. Action occurs under a shrine-like roof suspended high above the floor. Two enormous wrestlers, the heavier the better, in general confront each other in a raised circle of well-tamped earth bounded by the heavy braided ceremonial rope called the shiminawa. As they enter the ring, the giants sprinkle handfuls of salt to purify the space. They squat and spread their arms in an ancient samurai gesture, designed to assure opponents that they carry no weapons. A referee dressed in ancient ceremonial garb signals the beginning and end of a match and declares a winner, using deliberate, archaic gestures. Sumo champions are among Japan's highest paid and most popular athletes. The best of them do countless product endorsements and parades of sumo greats led Olympians into the arena when Japan hosted the Games at Nagano in 1998. Complex as the phenomenon has become in Japanese society today, sumo has its roots in the same simplicity and basic feeling for nature that pervades so much of Shinto tradition.
Do Jews use statues or other similar imagery in worship?
Along with Islam, Judaism has traditionally avoided three-dimensional figural art altogether in its ritual life. The prohibition against setting up any graven images that is part of the Decalogue may have arisen as a way of establishing a clear distinction between Israel and its pagan neighbors, whose polytheistic beliefs were so vividly portrayed in the images they seemed to worship. The need to prevent believers from backsliding into pagan cultic practices was so strong that the prohibition of representational images in 3 dimensions was virtually absolute. There are minor exceptions. Some smaller ritual objects, such as Torah shields, depict human beings and animals in high relief. Surprisingly, some of these images even include sacred figures like Moses and Abraham. But these are extremely rare. A number of prominent sculptors have been Jewish, but they have typically not produced their work for explicitly ritual settings, even when the subject matter is expressly religious. Ancient mural and mosaic arts, as well as more recent, especially medieval, manuscript art, are another story. Illuminated texts, even some of the Bible, contain figural images of human beings and animals. But these are generally not done in very realistic fashion.